It was December 1944, the heart of the European winter, and the forests of the Ardennes lay buried beneath a thick shroud of snow. The war in Europe seemed nearly won. American and British forces had smashed through France, liberated Paris, and stood on the doorstep of Germany itself. Many believed the end was near. But Adolf Hitler had one last card to play, a desperate, audacious counterattack meant to split the Allied armies in two, retake the port of Antwerp, and perhaps force a peace on his terms. What followed would become the last great German offensive of the war, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. And at the very center of that storm stood a small Belgian town called Bastogne, and a few hundred American soldiers who refused to yield. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the German army unleashed a thunderous assault across a 50-mile front. Over 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and countless guns smashed into thinly spread American lines. The Allies had not expected an attack in this rugged region. They thought the dense Ardennes forest was impenetrable for armored warfare. But the Germans had used this terrain once before, in 1940, when their panzers burst through and rolled over France. Now they sought to repeat that miracle. The U.S. forces in the area were mostly green troops, tired, under-equipped, or resting from prior battles. When the first shells began to fall, chaos erupted. Whole units were cut off. Supply lines shattered, and communication collapsed. Towns and villages fell one by one as German spearheads pushed westward with astonishing speed. Their goal? Seize Bastogne, a vital crossroads town. Every road in the southern Ardennes seemed to lead there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire region. As reports flooded into Allied headquarters, panic began to set in. Field Marshal Montgomery in the north and General Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters both realized that if Bastogne fell, the Germans could pour through, capture Antwerp, and trap 4 Allied armies in a massive encirclement. The stakes could not have been higher. And yet, there were few reserves nearby to plug the gap. Only one elite division was close enough to respond, the 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division. These were some of America's toughest soldiers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden. They were resting near Reims, France, when the call came in. "The Germans have broken through," the order said. "You're moving out immediately. Destination? Bastogne." Trucks roared to life. Men grabbed rifles, ammunition, and blankets, whatever they could carry. Snow fell hard as the columns rumbled toward the front. For many, it felt like déjà vu, another winter, another desperate mission. They didn't know it yet, but they were driving straight into one of the most heroic stands in U.S. military history. By the morning of December 18th, Bastogne was a hive of confusion. Refugees clogged the roads, German patrols prowled nearby forests, and American units were scattered across the countryside. Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored Division had sent small team detachments, Team Désaubry, Team Cherry, Team O'Hara, to hold key villages north and south of town. Each team consisted of a few hundred men, tanks, and anti-tank guns. Their orders? Delay the Germans at all costs. Among these groups were roughly 300 men who would soon make their mark on history. One of them was Team Désaubry, stationed in the village of Noville just north of Bastogne. They numbered only a few hundred, with a handful of Sherman tanks, some half-tracks, and a scattering of paratroopers from the 506th Regiment of the 101st Airborne. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Désaubry, was a tough, capable officer, known for his calm under fire. On December 19th, as dawn broke through a frozen mist, the distant rumble of tanks echoed across the hills. German armor was coming, lots of it. Désaubry's men took up defensive positions. They knew they were outnumbered. What they didn't know was by how much. The German forces advancing on Noville belonged to the elite 2nd Panzer Division, spearheaded by thousands of men and dozens of tanks, nearly 10,000 troops in all, rolling toward Bastogne from the north. Against them stood just a few hundred Americans with limited ammunition and almost no artillery. When the first German panzers appeared through the fog, the Americans held their fire. The air was still, the snow muffling every sound except the low growl of engines. Then, with a thunderous crack, the first American gun fired. The shell slammed into a German Panther tank, engulfing it in flames. That single shot ignited one of the most desperate fights of the entire Ardennes campaign. The Germans came on in waves, their tanks firing blindly through the haze. The Americans, dug into foxholes and behind stone walls, returned fire with deadly precision. For every tank that fell, 3 more seemed to appear, yet de Zobry's men held. The Germans couldn't believe it. How could a force so small resist so fiercely? For hours the battle raged. Buildings crumbled, trees splintered, and snow turned black with soot. De Zobry was wounded by shrapnel, but refused to leave his post. He shouted orders from the command post, rallying his men again and again. At one point, when ammunition ran low, paratroopers crawled through enemy lines to retrieve rounds from burning vehicles. The courage of these few hundred men was astonishing. By nightfall, Nouville was a shattered ruin, but the Americans were still there, fighting yard by yard. When the order finally came to withdraw toward Bastogne, they had delayed the German advance by a full day, buying precious time for the 101st Airborne to dig in around the town. That single day would make all the difference. As the survivors limped back into Bastogne, frostbitten and exhausted, General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was organizing the defense. He had barely 10,000 men to hold a perimeter that ideally required 3 times that number. Supplies were scarce, ammunition was limited, there was no winter clothing, and temperatures had plunged below freezing. Worse still, on December 20th, the Germans completed their encirclement. Bastogne was surrounded, cut off from the outside world. The siege had begun. For the Americans inside, it was as if they had been dropped into hell. Shells screamed overhead day and night. Food ran short. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals in basements and barns. There was no air support. The weather was too bad for planes to fly. But morale somehow remained unbroken. The men of Bastogne had one mission: hold the line. And somewhere in the freezing darkness, the survivors from those 300 men who had delayed the German advance knew they had done their part to make it possible. The ring had closed. The town of Bastogne was surrounded on all sides by German armor and infantry, and the only road in or out was under constant fire. The 101st Airborne Division, the 10th Armored, and a scattering of engineers, medics, and artillery crews, roughly 11,000 men in total, now faced a German force almost 5 times their size. And yet they didn't panic. They dug in, fortified buildings, set up roadblocks, and turned every street into a defensive position. To the men inside the perimeter, it wasn't about grand strategy or politics. It was about survival, about holding just one more day, one more hour, against impossible odds. The siege began in earnest on December 21st, 1944. The Germans, led by General Heinrich Freiherr von Lückwitz of the 47 Panzer Corps, demanded Bastogne's surrender. They sent 2 officers under a white flag to deliver a written ultimatum. It was cold and formal, promising honorable treatment if the Americans laid down their arms, and complete annihilation if they refused. The note was delivered to General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. He read it, shook his head, and muttered one word that would echo through history: nuts. When the German officers returned for the reply, Colonel Joseph Harper handed them McAuliffe's message. The Germans were confused. "What does this mean?" they asked. Harper smiled. "In plain English, it means go to hell." That single word, nuts, became a symbol of American defiance, a rallying cry for everyone trapped inside the frozen town. It wasn't bravado, it was belief. Belief that they could hold, that they could endure. The next day, the Germans attacked from all sides. Panzers rolled forward through the snow, their tracks grinding over ice and rubble. Infantry poured through the woods, firing from the hip. The Americans responded with everything they had: Bazookas, machine guns, mortars even captured German weapons. Each time the Germans broke through one line, another stood waiting. The defenders had turned Bastogne into a fortress. The town itself became a labyrinth of fire and smoke. Houses were blown apart, streets cratered, and every basement became a bunker. The 327th Glider Infantry held the eastern approaches. The 501st Parachute Infantry guarded the northern roads. To the west, the remnants of the 10th Armored Division held the line with burning tanks and broken half-tracks. Men fought, froze, and bled for every inch of ground. Medical supplies were running dangerously low. In the makeshift aid stations, doctors worked with bare hands, sometimes using morphine meant for animals, sometimes nothing at all. They amputated frozen limbs by lantern light, the screams muffled by blankets. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the dead in a pale, silent shroud. For 8 days, the siege dragged on. The Germans launched wave after wave of assaults, but each time the Americans held. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. Many soldiers suffered frostbite. Some froze to death in their foxholes. Yet morale, unbelievably, remained high. "We're surrounded," one paratrooper said with a grin. "That simplifies our problem of getting to the enemy." It was gallows humor, but it captured the spirit of Bastogne perfectly. They knew no help was coming soon. They were alone, cut off, and nearly out of everything. But not out of courage. The battlefields around Bastogne were scenes of both horror and heroism. In the woods near Marvy, a small group of paratroopers fought off a full German company using grenades and close-quarters combat until their rifles ran dry. Near Shaw, machine gunners from the 502nd Parachute Infantry held their line even as German tanks fired point-blank into their positions. Every engagement was personal, close, and brutal. The Germans grew frustrated. They had expected Bastogne to fall quickly, but the stubborn Americans refused to break. Each failed assault cost them men, time, and fuel, the very things they couldn't afford to waste. Meanwhile, far to the west, General George S. Patton's Third Army was on the move. When the news of Bastogne's encirclement reached him, Patton immediately ordered a pivot, one of the most dramatic maneuvers of the war. He turned his entire army 90 degrees north in the middle of winter, over icy roads and through blizzards, to relieve the trapped garrison. His men marched day and night, fighting both the enemy and the weather. The distance was short on the map, but it felt endless. Inside Bastogne, the defenders had no way of knowing that help was coming. Radio contact was limited. Supplies were nearly gone. The wounded filled cellars. The dead were frozen where they fell. On Christmas Eve, the sky glowed red with artillery fire. German shells rained down on the town for hours, shattering what little shelter remained. But amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. The skies began to clear. For the first time in days, the clouds broke and the sun shone weakly through the cold air. That break in the weather changed everything. The next morning, Christmas Day, Allied planes roared over Bastogne. C-47 transport aircraft dropped bundles of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, their parachutes dotting the white landscape with bursts of color. P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down to strafe German positions, shredding convoys and gun emplacements. The men cheered as the sky filled with the roar of engines. It felt like salvation. The tide was turning. That same day, the Germans launched one of their heaviest attacks yet. Tanks from the Panzerlehr Division smashed into the southern perimeter near Marvy, supported by waves of infantry. For hours, the fighting was savage. The 327th Glider Infantry held by their fingernails, supported by artillery firing point-blank at advancing tanks. In one instance, a single 57mm anti-tank gun crew knocked out 3 Panzers before being blown apart by return fire. The line held, but barely. Then, just when it seemed the Germans might finally break through, the distant rumble of engines echoed from the south. It was faint at first, almost impossible to distinguish from the wind, but it grew louder, steadier, closer. And then, through the snow and smoke, American tanks appeared, Shermans with white stars on their sides rolling toward the town. The lead tank belonged to the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army. After days of grueling combat and unimaginable cold, the relief of Bastogne had arrived. The men inside the town erupted in cheers. Soldiers climbed from their foxholes, waving, shouting, laughing, despite their exhaustion. After more than a week of siege, the line had been broken. Bastogne was free, but the cost had been immense. The 101st Airborne and their supporting units had lost over 2,500 men. Hundreds were dead, thousands wounded or frostbitten. Yet their stand had held the center of the Allied line. Without Bastogne, the entire front might have collapsed, and the war in Europe could have dragged on for months longer. Those 300 men who had first faced the German tide at Nouville, outnumbered 30-1, had delayed the enemy just long enough for the defense of Bastogne to be organized. Their courage, their sacrifice, had changed the course of the battle. Patton himself visited Bastogne after the relief. He stood among the ruins, looked at the battered paratroopers, and simply said, "You guys are the best damn soldiers in the world." The Battle of Bastogne became one of the defining moments of the Second World War. It was a story of endurance, defiance, and unity under impossible pressure. It showed what ordinary men could do when pushed to the edge, when every instinct told them to run, but something deeper told them to stand. In the freezing forests of Belgium, surrounded and outnumbered, a few hundred soldiers had stared down an entire German army and refused to yield. And in doing so, they wrote one of the greatest chapters in American military history. The smoke had barely cleared when the survivors of Bastogne began to understand what they had truly endured. The town itself was little more than rubble. Buildings were gutted, roads churned to mud and ice, and the smell of cordite and burning fuel hung heavy in the air. The men of the 101st Airborne, their faces gaunt and frostbitten, wandered through the ruins in silence. Some laughed quietly, others simply stared, numb from exhaustion and grief. They had held the line. They had done the impossible, and yet few of them felt like heroes. Most were too cold, too hungry, too tired to think about glory. All they wanted was warmth, food, and rest. But in the days and weeks that followed, the magnitude of their stand began to sink in. Reporters arrived to record the story. The name Bastogne spread across newspapers around the world, becoming synonymous with defiance and resilience. General Eisenhower called the defense a masterpiece of tactical tenacity. General Patton praised it as a shining example of the American fighting spirit. Even the German High Command, in post-war accounts, admitted their surprise and frustration at the ferocity of the defense. One officer from the 2nd Panzer Division later wrote, "We met not men, but devils in American uniform." For the soldiers themselves, though, Bastogne was not a symbol but a memory, a frozen blur of fear, courage, and survival. The 300 who had faced the German onslaught at Nouville became legends among their peers. Many of them had not survived. Those who did carried the scars for life. Their delaying action had cost the Germans precious hours, enough for McAuliffe's division to dig in and prepare. It was a textbook example of how a small force, properly placed and fiercely determined, could alter the course of an entire campaign. After the relief of Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge raged on for weeks. The German offensive, its momentum spent, began to crumble. By January 1945, Allied forces had pushed the enemy back toward the Rhine. Hitler's last gamble had failed. The war in Europe would end within 5 months. But for those who had fought at Bastogne, the battle never truly ended. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. The sound of distant artillery, the endless cold, the faces of friends frozen in the snow. Years later, when veterans returned to Bastogne, they found a different world. The town had been rebuilt, the fields green again. Memorials stood where men had fallen, simple stones bearing names that once echoed in shouted orders and whispered prayers. The people of Bastogne never forgot. To this day they honor the men who defended their town. In December they light candles in their windows to remember the week when freedom itself seemed to hang by a thread. And among the names carved into monuments and plaques are those of the 300 who faced the first onslaught, who stood in the path of 10,000 Germans and refused to move. Their courage was not born of hope for victory, but of duty and brotherhood, the unspoken bond that ties soldiers together when everything else falls apart. They were ordinary men from ordinary places, farm boys, clerks, mechanics, students. Yet when history demanded the extraordinary, they delivered. The numbers almost defy belief. Against 10,000 German soldiers, supported by tanks and artillery, a few hundred Americans held their ground for an entire day and night. They inflicted heavy casualties, destroyed dozens of vehicles, and delayed a division long enough to save Bastogne. When they finally withdrew, they did so in order, carrying their wounded, still firing as they fell back. It is one of the purest examples of small unit heroism in modern warfare. Military historians often debate the turning points of the Second World War: Stalingrad, Midway, D-Day. But among those great battles, Bastogne holds a special place. It was not a grand offensive or a sweeping maneuver. It was a stand, a refusal to surrender when logic said surrender was inevitable. It was the embodiment of grit, endurance, and faith in one another. In many ways, Bastogne was a microcosm of the entire war: chaos, sacrifice, and the unyielding determination to stand against tyranny no matter the odds. In the frozen forests and shattered fields of Belgium, those 300 men showed the world what that meant. As the war ended and the soldiers returned home, their lives diverged. Some stayed in the army. Others became farmers, teachers, mechanics, fathers, and grandfathers. Most rarely spoke of what they had seen. When asked about Bastogne, they would shrug and say, "We just did our job." But history remembered for them. Decades later, filmmakers, historians, and authors would revisit their story in documentaries, books, and films that tried to capture the impossible tension of that siege. Yet no movie, no reenactment could fully convey what it meant to stand in that snow, surrounded, starving, and still refusing to give in. The real Bastogne was not about glory. It was about survival and belief. Belief that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would come, and that someone, somewhere, was fighting to reach them. That belief became reality when Patton's tanks broke through the German lines. The moment those Shermans rolled into town, a spark of hope ignited, not just in Bastogne, but across the entire Allied front. It proved that the German war machine, once feared unstoppable, could be beaten, not just by numbers or technology, but by courage. Today, Bastogne stands quiet, a peaceful town surrounded by rolling hills and quiet woods. The scars of war have faded, but they have not vanished. If you walk the countryside, you can still see traces of foxholes and trenches, the ghosts of men who once shivered and fought there. In the center of town stands the Mardassen Memorial, a massive stone star inscribed with the names of the American states whose sons fought and died there. Visitors come from around the world to stand beneath its arches and read the words carved into its base. The grateful people of Bastogne remember their American liberators. Beneath that memorial, the wind whispers through the trees, carrying echoes of the past. The crack of rifles, the rumble of tanks, the defiant cry of "nuts," whispered like a prayer. For those who listen closely, Bastogne is still speaking. It tells a story not only of war, but of will, of how ordinary men can rise to extraordinary heights when history demands it. And at the heart of that story are those 300 soldiers who, against all odds, faced 10,000 enemies and refused to yield. They stood not because they expected to win, but because surrender was unthinkable, because someone had to stand, because sometimes history turns not on vast armies, but on a handful of men who refuse to back down. The Battle of Bastogne was more than a military engagement. It was a testament to the power of endurance, the unbreakable spirit of the human heart, and the price of freedom. It reminded the world that even in the darkest winter, courage burns bright enough to light the way forward. As the snows of that terrible winter melted away and spring returned to Europe. The world moved on. But Bastogne remained, a symbol, a warning, a promise, a symbol of courage, a warning against complacency, a promise that freedom, once earned, must always be defended. And so, when we look back today and ask how 300 American soldiers stopped 10,000 Germans, the answer is simple and timeless. They stood together. They fought for each other. They believed that no force, no army, no winter could break them. They were cold, hungry, and surrounded, but they were not defeated. They were Bastogne.